Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center here at Portland State, and I will be introducing today's seminar. Our PSU transportation seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are once again being held live on the Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and to honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are very pleased to have Cassie Wilson here presenting on Oregon in Motion, Shaping Communities Through State Transportation Legislation. This was also a seminar that got rescheduled from a few weeks ago, so I appreciate Cassie's flexibility, and I appreciate those of you in person and online who joined for this reschedule. Cassie is Thousand Friends of Oregon's Transportation Policy Manager. Cassie first connected with Thousand Friends as a member of our Land Use Leadership Initiative cohort in 2021. This experience ignited her passion for local land use and transportation advocacy. Cassie later joined Thousand Friends as our 2023 Paul Gerhardt Jr. intern, during which she completed the Oregon in Motion report, interviewing subject matter specialists on critical transportation policies and programs around the state. Cassie brings a wealth of policy, political, community organizing, and coalition experience to this role. Most recently, she worked as a legislative assistant during the Oregon 2024 short session. And to me, at least most importantly, she has a bachelor's degree in liberal studies from Portland State University. We love showcasing the great work of our alums here at the seminar. And a strong commitment to sustainability. Cassie is dedicated to driving positive change in Oregon's land use policies. Before I turn things over to Cassie, I am going to preview our last transportation seminar of the academic year. We have Dr. Bruce Appleyard from San Diego State University talking about Streets Are for People, Livable Streets 2.0. So I hope we can see some of you in person and virtually for that event. Quick overview of today's seminar, particularly for the folks watching virtually. Our speaker is going to present for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. We will be receiving the virtual questions through the Q&A feature on your control panel, and we'll be asking them at the end. If we do run out of time, we always share those questions with our speaker. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. We are recording today's seminar. The recording will be available on our website later today, along with this presentation slides. And if you are tracking professional development hours, this is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Cassie. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really cool to be back. I actually took the Friday transportation seminars for credit as a student a couple years ago. So I only just graduated in March. So cool to be back so soon. As mentioned, I'm currently working at Thousand Friends of Oregon as their transportation policy manager. I interned for them last summer when I got to spend 10 weeks working on the Oregon in Motion report and talking to people around the state. And so today I'm gonna be giving kind of an overview of what's in there. It's 60 pages long. So, hopefully this is a good introduction, and then you can dive into the parts that you want to learn more about. So first of all, just wanted to talk about how I went about my research, because even though 2017 is, very much part of the digital age, and you would think it'd be pretty easy to dig stuff up about something, it actually really wasn't. There was a lot of broken links and just, it was hard to dig up anything that isn't a current program or the most recent report on things. But I did get to interview 30 people from around the state, and I, actually read the hundreds of pages of House Bill 2017 that the report focused on. And then there was, I was able to find some old news articles and things like that that did cover some of the political dynamics from the time, because a lot of the folks I talked to, it was like, there have been so many legislative sessions since then that it was hard to remember what the dynamics were like back then. And so a lot of people actually found it helpful to be able to relive it through my report as we get ready for the anticipated 2025 package. But first I want to jump into, why does 1000 Friends of Oregon care about transportation? What is the land use and transportation connection? And for anyone not familiar with Oregon's land use planning system in particular, where does that connect in? So in 1973, Oregon passed Senate Bill 100 to establish Oregon's land use planning program. It was designed to protect farm and forest land and develop our communities responsibly. That also created the Land Conservation and Development Commission, which went on a listening tour to then establish Oregon's 19 statewide planning goals. Goal 12 focuses on transportation and calls on local jurisdictions to create safe, convenient, and economic transportation systems that consider all modes. It actually even specifically says to avoid principal reliance on one mode, and to minimize adverse impacts from the transportation system and meet the needs of transportation disadvantaged folks and support the movement of goods and services. So in other words, land use affects where we live, work, study, and recreate, and that affects how we travel, as do our transportation options where we are. Because if we live in an area of low density sprawl, it's gonna pretty much force us to have to drive if it is gonna take an hour plus on transit or via other modes. And transportation infrastructure itself, it also is part of land use in the sense that whether we choose to build housing or green space or a giant parking lot or an 8-lane freeway, there's always a trade-off between how we're using the space in our communities, as well as the modes that get us around have different levels of efficiency in terms of it takes up a lot more space to move people around in single occupancy vehicles than it does on a bus or via bike or walking or rolling. Historically, freeways have been built through Black and low-income communities, primarily for the benefit of white suburban commuters. And the communities that those freeways were built through have had to bear the brunt of the negative externalities in terms of lower air quality, noise pollution, et cetera. And that wasn't by accident. That was a choice when we were designing our transportation system, which is very much tied to land use. And similarly, now that those, now that the freeways are there, often seeing affordable housing being what the type of housing that's built by those facilities, rather than market rate or luxury housing, because there's clearly a trade-off in having to live next to a freeway. And similarly, with industrial lands, folks in the Portland area might know about the current issue facing the Park Rose community in regards to a trucking facility that's proposed for across from a bunch of schools in the neighborhood that would add a lot of truck traffic on top of existing safety concerns. And then In terms of the housing and transportation connection, again, it's also just hard to find housing where it's both in your budget and located by transportation options that are abundant. Often these days, people are having to obviously pick housing that's in their budget and then take whatever transportation options they get where that is. And then in terms of equity, approximately 1 in 4 Oregonians don't have a driver's license. That is a lot of people, and it is not just people who live where there are transportation options. A lot of folks rely on friends and family to get where they need to go, or walking on the shoulders of roads that don't have infrastructure to keep them safe. So clearly we have a long way to go to get to the vision that's laid out in goal 12 of our land use planning goals. But transportation packages are a way that we can keep moving in that direction based on where we're prioritizing putting our funding. So for those less familiar with state legislation on transportation, historically, Oregon has passed transportation packages about every 8 years or so, largely motivated by the fact that we never indexed the gas tax to inflation. And so we're constantly having to come back and raise it because that money is not going as far and we're running out and not able to keep up with basic maintenance and operations. And additionally, other reasons that we constantly need to revisit it is to make sure that we actually are meeting the needs of everyone in Oregon when it comes to transportation, because obviously the past has historically prioritized people who can drive and has invested significantly less in other modes, and also across geography. One of the things I'll talk about later is how the transit funding in 2017 was a big deal around the state, and especially for smaller transit agencies. And then the world is also just always changing. And so we're always having to adapt our transportation system to that. So both with taking action on reducing emissions around climate change, but also the changing climate itself affecting the infrastructure and how resilient it is. Because also a lot of our infrastructure is just old and needs to be replaced. And then also as the population ages and demographics change, we need to be responsive to making sure that people's needs are met. And so state transportation packages usually include funding mechanisms, establish new programs and projects, and then have accountability measures for those to make sure that they're doing what they're set out to do. So I did a deep dive into the last Oregon State Transportation Package, which was House Bill 2017 in 2017. But it actually didn't start in 2017. It started with an attempt at a transportation package in 2015. At the time, the conversation was a lot like the things we're hearing today in terms of ODOT's out of money and we need long-term and diverse funding mechanisms. But when they tried to do it in 2015, Governor Kitzhaber had put together a panel to start doing listening tours and having conversations, but then it was around the time that he resigned from office. And so that all fell off in the transition. And there was no engagement to take its place, but the legislature still moved forward with trying to put together a package that session. And from a lot of the folks I talked to and old testimony that I read, people just did not feel like the package that was put together in 2015 actually represented what any of the community or stakeholders were really asking for. And at the time, that was also when the legislature was establishing the new Clean Fuels program. And so it was being pitted against the transportation package. It was pretty much which thing will reduce emissions more. And so that was a non-starter for climate advocates, for a lot of the environmental caucus in the legislature. And ultimately, it came out later on that the emissions projections related to the 2015 package were incorrect, and it would not be as significant as originally thought. And so they moved forward with the Clean Fuels program and scrapped the transportation package to start again. And 2017 was a much better experience from everyone I talked to. The governor reconvened the panel to go around the state. The legislature had their own committee that went around the state, and stakeholders and community members were brought to the table. So that package really did reflect the climate and equity and multimodal considerations that people were asking for. And that was necessary because when you're going to raise taxes, you need a 2/3 majority vote in the legislature. And so they truly had to listen to what everyone wanted to build the support needed across the state to pass a new transportation package. And then I just have this quote here from my report, but again, yeah, everyone I talked to said that that was one of the more inclusive processes so far for development of a state transportation package compared to 2009 and packages before then. So diving into some of the contents of the last state transportation package, they did do exactly what they set out to do and diversified our funding streams. I mean, they of course increased the gas tax and the weight mile tax for heavy vehicles, but which, kicked the can down the road. So we can talk about that later, how we are still in the same position of running out of money. But it also established a bunch of new mechanisms, including the vehicle dealer privilege tax, the bike sales tax, the employee payroll tax for transit. And then it also asked the legislature, it asked ODOT to look at congestion pricing, tolling, value pricing. It's been called a million things since 2017, but that's kind of where that conversation started. Despite all of the new funding mechanisms, though, when you look at the package as a whole, a majority of the funding is still going to roads, to drivers in that regard, compared to bike, ped, and transit. But it was a historic shift in making it an actually multimodal package. And then some of the programs and projects in the bill, it specifically named several of the freeway projects in the Portland metro area and allocated money towards them. It created grants for safe routes to school infrastructure, which has had tremendous impacts that I can't wait to share more about. It established the Oregon's electric vehicle rebate program, which has been oversubscribed, as have most of these programs. And so actually they had to pause accepting applications for a while because they had no money to give out. And I'm pretty sure it was this year or last year in the legislative session, they tried to get more to get through until the next transportation package, but it didn't happen. So this, of course, predominantly ends up impacting people who wouldn't be able to afford an electric vehicle without those rebates. So that's unfortunate. And then, yeah, transit funding, finally sustainable transit funding in our state, huge, absolutely transformative. And then it also added funding to the off-roadway and bike ped pathways program, which at the time was called Connect Oregon, but now it's been separated off into the Oregon Community Paths program. And that was, from talking to the program director, that was the first time that the state had really looked at off-roadway bike and ped paths as transportation and not just recreation. And that's also important because the Safe Routes to School money is restricted to being part of the right of way because it comes from the gas tax, so it's constitutionally restricted to be within the right of way. And sometimes it's those off-roadway trails that actually work best to connect students and families to the schools in their neighborhood. And then the part of how the distribution of funding works from the state is the 50-30-20 split, between 50% going to the state, 30% going to counties, 20% going to cities, so that way they can do what they need to do with it. And then there was a bunch of jurisdictional transfers named in 2017 and absolutely no money put towards that. For anyone who doesn't know, jurisdictional transfers would be changing like state highways to be instead owned by the city or county. So that way, because a lot of them are cities' main streets nowadays, but they're not being treated that way, and ODOT's not been maintaining them as such. And so the idea is that cities and counties would have more motivation to take care of them and make them safer. But ODOT has to be able to bring them up to a certain standard before they can be transferred. And so with no money to actually do that, that didn't go anywhere. But since then, there was actually another bill passed that created a committee that would recommend 3 different facilities for transfer every long session. So that way the legislature gets a better idea of which ones to prioritize. Because when they passed money for the 82nd Avenue transfer in Portland, that was just kind of because there was legislators who were passionate about it and not because it was necessarily the only one by any means that needs to go through that process. And then the other thing that changed from 2017, there was actually a handful of things that changed because HB 2017 also established the Joint Committee on Transportation. Before that, my understanding is that the transportation committees were put together kind of as needed versus always having a focus on transportation. And so since they were looking at it every session, there were a lot more changes. And one of those was House Bill 3055 in 2021, I believe it was, which allowed the state to bond against expected tolls. And so that's how they've chosen to finance things like the I-205 Abernathy Bridge project, which now they're having to figure out how to pay for because tolling is paused, but they already bonded against the tolls that are not happening for the foreseeable future. So now they gotta figure out where that money's coming from because they still have to pay it off. In terms of impacts of the stuff that was included in House Bill 2017, the common thing that you'll hear legislative leadership talking about today is that a lot of the big roadway projects that were included have not been completed. I-5 Rose Quarter has not been built. I-205, it was only the Abernathy Bridge part, not the rest of the expansion that they wanted. So there were a lot of things left incomplete, and they're now absolutely ballooned in cost in the billions of dollars. But there were other less like excitingly portrayed parts of this that have been really essential, like the 50-30-20 split to fund local jurisdictions and being able to maintain and improve their local transportation system. As well as there was also extra funding for small cities and counties, which was really critical. Because as things have gotten more expensive, they need to be able to just maintain, let alone be able to increase, like to improve the roads in their communities. But there are still significant maintenance and operations and resiliency needs across the state. I've included throughout this presentation some quotes from people I talked to because I feel like they said it very well. So Noelle Mickelberry, the former executive director of Oregon Walks, at the time of House Bill 2017 said, so many compromises were made for those mega projects and here we are and they're ballooned out of control, but they're written into law. which I feel like is an interesting point, that unless the legislature goes and makes them not statutorily mandated, then ODOT has to keep proceeding as if, you know, this has to happen because they wrote it into law that it does. But they also don't have the money to do it, so then they have to keep coming back and asking for more. Excited to share about the Safe Routes to School impacts because this grant infrastructure funding got over 100 projects built across the state. It's allowed sidewalk projects to be built that have been written into plans and awaiting funding for over a decade. And then when you combine it with federal and local programming funding for Safe Routes to School, the impact is even more extraordinary, because it's one thing to build a sidewalk, but it's another thing to have a local program coordinator who's like doing events and walks to school, whether it's like walking school buses or just the occasional, you know, group walk. Because it's like, if you're not used to having safe transportation infrastructure in your community, you're always going to be inclined to go however you were going before. And so to have somebody help you break that routine and experience what it's like to navigate your community with that new infrastructure really goes a long way. But this program is significantly oversubscribed. I've heard 3 to 5 times oversubscribed in terms of more demand than there is funding available. And sometimes the infrastructure changes that are made are not enough to make families feel safe having their children cross certain roads. Like I was talking to a Safe Routes to School coordinator who serves schools along the coast, and crossing Highway 101 is a big issue because folks driving through there aren't necessarily thinking about the fact that people live there, especially if they're, you know, traveling through, if they're tourists. And so, and plus, you know, parts of that highway are 5 lanes, just wide open, flat, like really nothing to make people think to slow down to, like, I think it's like 35 going through Florence, but it's built like you could be going 45, 50. And so unless there's more done, then those flashing beacons only go so far. And then another conversation I had too is that, you know, as these improvements are made, sometimes students and their families don't get to benefit from them because they're also being priced out of where they live. And so then they're being priced out to, especially folks living on the coast, are being priced, you know, more into the coast range and having to drive in no matter what. So, you know, anti-displacement definitely needs to be a part of the transportation conversation. I think historically it really hasn't been part of, you know, when we're talking about transportation packages, we're not talking about how do we make sure the people living there can stay and benefit from those improvements. And then, yeah, this was Megan Scholl, who, works in Lane County as their Safe Routes to School coordinator, said, my program has been very useful in giving students the tools they need to know how to traverse their built environment. Because part of it too is not only the new infrastructure, but just like, how do you safely cross the street when the sidewalk ends on one side, but it starts again over there? And so that was interesting to hear about, just how just even learning how to safely navigate the infrastructure you already have is an important part of giving students or families the tools they need to explore their options. As I mentioned earlier, the transit funding has been completely transformative across the state. And it couldn't have come at a better timing. The rollout of the funding started in 2019. And so it absolutely kept transit agencies afloat through the pandemic. Transit agencies around the state were able to expand or create new service where and when it didn't exist before. My favorite story that I've heard so far is Chariots in Salem. They were able to reinstate Saturday service for the first time in over a decade. And they had never had Sunday service before and were able to include that as well as expand their weekday hours. And so it's like, when they launched that weekend service, they had people being like, I've never seen downtown Salem on the weekend, because they couldn't get there. It also expanded access for lower fares for students. Cause I think it was like the year after this passed, there was like a 1% requirement where 1% has to go towards student transportation costs, of what's allocated to transit agencies. But as with most of the good things that were funded in 2017, it's still not enough. I was talking to some more rural transit providers and they were saying, you know, they still aren't receiving enough where it's helping them meet things like the federal grant match requirements to be able to afford electric buses. That's still out of reach for many of them. And then also just the way that the transit funding is dispersed presents challenges because it's dispersed based on where you work, because it's a payroll tax. But that means it's not accounting for where you live too. And so that's something we've been, that I've been talking to folks around the state about, because it makes it harder for creating regional connections, inner city connections, because it's really dependent on the cities that do have a bigger piece of pie to be motivated and hopefully expand out to the cities that don't. And in general, Oregon still lacks a lot of inner city and regional transit connections. And it's been interesting talking to agencies in the Portland metro area about how regional connections are funded and planned. It mostly goes through TriMet. And there was like something sort of vaguely written into 2017, like requiring the bigger agencies to have to consider it, but nothing requiring them to fund it. But TriMet has chosen to fund things like the Clackamas County shuttles that fill gaps in where TriMet doesn't serve, or Sandy just launched a new line that goes from Sandy to Clackamas Town Center, which is absolutely huge. It is the closest I've had a bus stop to my house in my life, which I was very excited about. But one thing I noticed when I was learning about the public transit part of this bill is that there was no specific carve-outs or increases in funding for paratransit. And so paratransit funding hasn't been specifically increased since 2009. I think the belief is that the general transit funding will trickle down and help improve paratransit, but you know, as with most things, it's like if you're not doing an explicit like increase and carve out dedicated to to those programs, then it's not going to be as significant as if you did. Yeah, I talked to Ian Davidson, the Chariot's board vice president, and as I was sharing about Salem and Chariots, as he said, it has been utterly and completely transformational for our community. So, talking about where we're at now, a lot has changed in the world since 2017. I think that a lot more elected officials are becoming aware of the connections between climate and transportation in terms of 40% of our state's emissions coming from transportation, and recognizing that maybe just making everything electric vehicles isn't the cure-all to our problems after all. We've also had a lot more extreme climate events happen locally in terms of heat waves and wildfires and storms. It was interesting actually when I was finding photos to include in the report, and I was looking through ODOT's pictures. It was interesting to see, you know, storms around the state where it's like roads are just completely washed out by flooding. And then obviously the coast is continually impacted by erosion and Highway 101 washing out. The cost of living crisis has obviously not gotten any better, but having better transportation options or more of them could at least alleviate that for folks if we continue to expand those. The pandemic obviously changed commute and travel patterns and habits. The racial justice reckoning of 2020 has put more of an emphasis on equity. In 2017, they like sort of did some intentional equity stuff, at least with the transit part, because with the payroll tax being flat, like folks obviously felt like that was regressive. And so they wrote in a lot about like making sure that transit improvements would primarily benefit low income communities. And so I think there's definitely more though that could have been and needs to be done moving forward on including equity as part of the transportation package. And then as I mentioned earlier, you know, as the population continues to age, we need to make sure that people's transportation needs are continuing to be met, because if you get to a point in life where you shouldn't be driving anymore, you shouldn't feel like you have to keep driving because it's your only option. Some challenges that we have going into the next transportation package. Obviously, because of the cost of living crisis, it makes justifying new or increased taxes much more difficult. Even when it was already difficult before. There is still a deep desire by state leaders to finish the mega projects written into 2017. As I said, they're like billions of dollars. And in fact, in a recent Oregon Transportation Commission meeting, they were suggesting needing to delay projects around the state to fund some of the mega projects. And it's like, so for the cost of dozens and dozens of projects around the state, you could fund one mega project, or you could do things to help the whole state. It's a pretty unfair trade-off. And then there's been a lot of debates and questions over who's paying too much into the system, who's not paying enough. The folks who pay the weight mile tax, there's a study they do, they're very wonky that I don't even fully understand. There's like this highway cost allocation study they do that looks at, yeah, like who's getting, or like, is everyone getting getting out of the system what they're paying in? And so there's questions about adjusting the weight mile tax, and always questions around how much EVs should be paying, because it's like we're trying to incentivize the adoption of electric vehicles, but then they're not paying the gas tax. So then it's like, do we increase registration fees a whole bunch? Do we, but then there's also conversations about switching entirely to a road user charge, you know, charging you by the miles you drive. But in my opinion, they have not built up the public awareness or political support to do that right now, but I'll be curious to see if they actually explore that. But I also think, you know, going into the next package, we have a lot of opportunities. I think there's always an opportunity to shift away from the old way of doing things and make a transportation system that truly works for everyone and is funded through equitable means, and to create something that's better for the planet. And also 2017 created so many great programs that we've been able to see the positive impacts of, that it's like, we don't really need to reinvent the wheel for the most part. It's just that we need to make sure those programs have the funding they need to continue being successful. And if you want to dig more into thoughts on the future, there's a whole section in my report of recommendations for the next package. But I want to share a little bit about what other states are trying, because I think that was a fun part of my research, was looking at recent packages from other states. So I looked at Minnesota, Washington, and Colorado. In terms of funding mechanisms, many of them are doing retail delivery fees, which have safeguards built in to make sure people can still get groceries and medicine and things like that delivered without being taxed extra for that. Ride hailing fees. Washington uses their cap and invest carbon pricing program to pay for transit and things like that. I believe it was Minnesota that indexed their gas tax to inflation. They also did an urban sales tax to pay for transit. And then different states are doing different types of pilots around free transit for different categories of riders. So Washington made transit free for youth, including Amtrak Cascades and all the ferries in Washington. Minnesota made transit free for seniors and disabled people. Washington created a bicycle education program in schools, which I thought was really cool. I think we've seen some similar stuff try to happen through Safe Routes to School here, but this was a more intentional and direct approach at that. I believe it was Minnesota funded social workers on transit to increase safety on the system. And then in general, we've seen several different states doing more around if a project's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it, or maybe you should be looking at doing other projects that will help balance that out. If one's going to increase emissions, then the other needs to reduce. So there's definitely a lot of legislation that Oregon can look to for examples of where to head moving forward. And speaking of which, we are very much already diving into the 2025 package. State leaders like the Senate President and House Speaker and Governor are setting their expectations about what they want to see in the next package. So far, they're talking about maintenance and operations and building the freeways, and that's about it. So definitely going to be doing a lot of advocacy through my work to 1,000 Friends to make sure that it is so much more and better than that. So the Joint Committee on Transportation is going on a listening tour this summer, which I think was a good takeaway from what worked in 2017 is you do need to do that community engagement. You do need to hear from every part of the state because, you know, that was part of what helped positively influence the good things that came out of the last package. And yeah, in my work, I am part of a group of organizations forming a campaign around the next package. And so we're also having a campaign briefing on Tuesday night, if anyone is interested in coming and preparing for the first state of the tour, which is on June 4th at PCC Cascades in Portland. But yeah, there's definitely a lot to be hopeful about, a lot to be concerned about going into the next package, but it is interesting to think about how much of a similar place we're at in terms of, here we are again talking about how the state is out of money for transportation and we need to diversify revenue sources. And yeah, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next year. And yeah, how the package comes together and where the money goes and how it's funded and all of that. I think it's gonna be very interesting to watch and be part of. And yeah, that's all I've got.
So we have a question or two online, but I want to start in the room if anybody has any questions or, and if, yeah, go ahead.
The programs that you talked about from the 2017 package, like the Safe Routes to School and the 15-30-20 split, do any of those have expiration dates or will they keep going forward even if they're not mentioned in the new package?
I would have to double check that. I guess one interesting thing about each transportation package is usually it's written where it's like, it seems at least to me like it's written where it's only the increased amount of funding that is attributable to going to the places that it's allocated in that bill. So when we do another package and we allocate where the new increases go, that could change things around. But yeah, I would have to check on any sunsets. And they're usually sunsets that I was paying attention to, like I think there was something around the like the funding for I-5 Rose Quarter where it was a certain amount every year, and then like I think it was this year it started being either more or less or something like that. And then they had also done a change anyway where that could go to any of the other freeway projects, so, but yeah, I would have to check on sunset dates on anything, but I'm pretty sure they're designed to keep going.
We have one online, and I'll just say to people that are online, get your questions in, and if we don't get to them in this session, we'll email them to Cassie and see if she can answer them separately. But the first one online was, so thanks for the presentation with ODOT with $1 billion maintenance backlog, which they think, oh, maybe it's even bigger, and PBOT with a $4 billion backlog. There's a push to build still. What are the chances of putting a maintenance pay for requirement into the future package?
That is absolutely something that, at least from the advocacy side of things, we're talking about. RepCon FAM had introduced kind of, fix it first type policy in a past session, and we really want to see that brought back because, why keep expanding the system if you can't afford to maintain what you have? So that's definitely something being talked about.
Okay, so I don't have a driver's license. I heard you mention earlier in the presentation, I think you said 1 in 4 Oregonians don't have driver's license. And I don't know if I have a specific question, but I'm just trying to like wrap my head around that. And I mean, I can see in West Portland, living without a driver's license, but like out in, outside of the city and stuff, like, can you speak at all to just what are the implications of that? Like, what do people's lives look like who are adults, like, don't have driver's licenses?
I mean, I think, a big part of it, because where we pull that number from is if you look at the amount of people in the state with a license and the total population of the state, that's how you get to the 1 in 4. And so that can include a lot of youth, or, their parents are driving them everywhere they need to go, whereas in other countries, that's not necessarily the case. And then, I think it's mostly a lot of relying on friends and family, or otherwise really struggling to maintain a job, struggling to engage in any sort of higher education, and just generally struggling to advance in life, or being forced to move somewhere where you can get around without a car. I mean, for me, it was like, I really didn't want to learn how to drive, but I live in the middle of nowhere, no transit, no anything. And so I was like, oh, I have to learn how to drive because otherwise I can't finish school, I can't get a job, I can't do anything. I would also recommend checking out Anna Zyvarts in Washington did a report through the Disability Mobility Initiative through Disability Rights Washington that interviewed non-drivers across the whole state of Washington. And like what their experiences are like trying to navigate the transportation system there and how it impacts their lives. So I highly recommend that.
Thanks.
First off, thanks for an awesome presentation, super informative. My name is Jeremy Smith. I'm running for Portland City Council here in the 4th District. I'm wondering what we can do at the municipal level to resist freeway expansion.
Ooh, great question. So much of what I've done is at the state level that I'm like totally.
If we have to go lobby and scale
totally blanking at the moment, but I mean, I think if I remember right, I feel like for a while now, the city has been like stepped back from like the I-5 Rose Quarter project to some degree, like, not enthusiastically going after it. And so to some degree that helps because it's like, oh, they're not that motivated kind of thing. But then ODOT's also kind of like cough up some money, Portland. And so I mean, I think even just the fact that, if you're on council, you would be at the tables where these conversations are happening and being able to express a change of direction. I think when I looked up a project of like specifically the Rose Quarter one time, and I looked at like a timeline of it, like they've been talking about wanting to expand it since like way before I was born. So it's like, I think there's such like a forward motion of like not wanting to like go from the path that we've been on, but it's also like they've been talking about this for so long. It's also like change is inevitable and maybe another $1 billion isn't gonna fix the problem.
Sure. Is there another question?
Let's see, we got one here, and then we'll come back to you. So, yeah.
We spoke about the phenomenon of having a highway, state, or like a major county road serving as a small town's main street. And in the past, right, Dundee got the Dundee to Newburgh bypass for Oregon 99 to sort of bring back that walkability to that community as well as reduce traffic, but that is an expensive construction, maintenance option. I guess what I'm gonna ask is, has anybody heard of something called geofencing? Is that on the table to like, particularly freight? Because I live in a rural town, Highway 47 is Gaskins Main Street. And we have a lot of freight. And while we have a reduced speed limit within the city limits, right, unless there's a sheriff deputy sitting there, it's not enforced.
Right.
So I just wonder if anybody's heard about geofencing, if there's a thought about introducing that, particularly to enforce speed limits in small towns, especially where it's a highway for the main street.
That's interesting, yeah, I mean, I've personally heard it mostly in wonky transportation circles, but I haven't, I don't think we've talked as much about enforcement in general so far, so I'll have to bring that thought and question back. I will say in general, with anything technology related, people are like, don't track me, don't have information about me, don't, so. Oh, yeah, no, I know, we all have phones on us and technology on us at all times. That's always one of the first arguments, and will be with things like a VMT tax, things like that.
Well, one of the ways I saw it proposed was to speak to these companies about we all know about carbon footprint. And they would introduce something called their transportation footprint. And so like, not only could they say, you know, we're investing in newer or more electric vehicles in our fleet, but they could say, we use geofencing so that our drivers can't exceed the speed limit. And therefore, we're a safer freight company than our competitor. So that's one way to get past them.
Oh, that's interesting, I'll note it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Question online, and then we'll go back in the room. And actually, so there's, and I have a question myself, I'm intrigued by your discussion of the payroll tax and what that's gone to fund. And I'm interested, one, in kind of if you could talk at all about the magnitude of it in terms of kind of how many dollars or how much it is compared to other sources of transit funding. And if it's limited to infrastructure versus service, or can go either way. And then the question online was kind of getting to the sunsetting question. Will that payroll tax go away if it's not renewed, or what are the prospects for that in 2025?
No, I think the only conversation around the transit tax is increasing it, because it's been so impactful that it's like everyone's like, now imagine what we could do with even more. I cannot remember offhand how much STIF brings in per year, but it's in my report. I want to say it's like 100 million, but I don't remember. And then I don't think I looked at how that compared to other sources of transit funding, but I can't remember what year it was, but in House Bill 2017, it had only been written as like improvements to transit. So then they had to quickly go back and be like, and general operations and maintenance. So it absolutely just keeps transit agencies running in any way that they need.
Right, thanks.
Let's see, I had a question here. You talked about the mega projects and stuff going over budget. I'm new to the field, so this might be obvious to people who are in the field, but are there contingency plans kind of like when you start the project, it's like there's some percent chance that this is gonna go slightly over budget, some percent is gonna go way over budget. If it goes slightly, here's how we're gonna handle it. If it goes significantly, here, like, is that typical or is that not typical?
I'm actually not sure, but I know that historically ODOT goes over budget on projects, so. You can pretty much count on that. It's also interesting because it's like, it's not just being over budget during construction, it's more just like, so long as they're planning this, it's like, so. It's more like the constant delays of construction starting is where the estimated cost is going up. Plus then when it's under construction, if the costs keep going up or there's unexpected things that happen, like I'm pretty sure that the 205 Abernathy Bridge project already had to like a lot more money towards it because of just unexpected things that happened during construction that you tried to plan as much as you could for and then came up anyway. So I'm not sure what the requirements are there, but although that did remind me that I think one of the things that was in Washington's last package was that any projects over like 500 million or something like that have a complete streets requirement. So they have to fully and adequately consider all nodes. So that's one sort of way at least to make mega projects slightly better. So you can say that, but yeah, in terms of fiscal accountability, I'm not sure how it's handled right now.
Yeah, just to like elaborate a little, like, I don't know, maybe I'm like really analytical, but like I have like a budget for my personal finances and I can't always stick exactly like, X dollars a month for restaurants or whatever, but like if I do spend more on restaurants in 1 month, I'll like spend less on like entertainment or something like that. So that's kind of what I was thinking from the kind of state budgets and stuff. If it's like, if we go over here, do we have a plan? Like, we know where we're gonna like take it from, or are we just gonna kind of like be confused?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's kind of where it comes back to what they're considering now with like trying to take from other projects around the state and delay the projects to fund the mega projects, or they also, I mean, it was a pretty, the document about it was like pretty absurd. They were like, it would be a bad idea, but you could use the ADA per brand lawsuit money to pay. And then they were like, but that would be a bad idea. And it's like, so, I mean, they definitely consider taking from any bucket, but not in the direction we need to be going.
It sounds like, okay, I think it sounds like it's not decided up front. It's like, we'll figure it out like once.
It seems like it, yeah.
You had another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious if you support the inclusion of extending the Max line up to Vancouver, Washington, a I-5 expansion project, and who you think might initially be some opposition to having that actually go through.
Yeah, I mean, at 1000 Friends, that's one of our biggest priorities, and in making sure that any transit included is like placed in a way that it's actually where people are gonna use it in terms of close proximity to housing and schools and places of work and stuff. I think at the moment, most of the opposition is like, well, it would cost extra money, and it's like, well, rebuilding 7 interchanges and expanding several miles of freeway costs way more money. So it usually comes back to financial and just kind of typical political like motivation, and it's kind of the whole stereotypical crime train argument. It's a lot of the same, stuff that people say about like, well, what if you extend the Orange Line down to Oregon City? It's like, I feel like any extensions of light rail in particular always get those kinds of arguments. At the moment, I think at least what I know, that project is currently just like on hold waiting for the environmental impact statement stuff. So who knows how quickly or not that's all being moved forward. But I also can't remember if they ever figured out how they were gonna pay to run the like transit part of it, or who was gonna run it. I mean, I know TriMet and C-Tran and stuff have been at the table, but I don't know if like the legislature and if the two states have ever figured that much out. So it's never as much of a priority as roadway itself.
And on that note, we are at 3 o'clock, so let's thank Cassie and.
Thanks.